When I was an art history student, I remember learning about images of the Annunciation. The history of pre-modern Western art is filled with such images of this moment described in the book of Luke when God sends a messenger down. Gabriel, this angel from God, comes to Nazareth in Galilee, and he says, according to the text, to a young woman, "Hail, you are highly favored, the Lord is with you, blessed are you among women." The story tells us that Mary is troubled by Gabriel's arrival, and well she might be. Mary is young, given her time and place and history and the culture she was born into. We can relatively safely assume she was a girl of about 13 or so, about to or having just reached reproductive maturation. She's engaged to be married. And all of a sudden, here comes this angel of the Lord telling her that she's special. Seeing her surprise, Gabriel tells her to fear not, because God favors her and she will conceive and bear a son called Jesus, who will be great and whose kingdom will have no end. Mary responds, asking how this can be, given that she's never been with a man. And Gabriel tells her that the Holy Spirit will come over her and it will all just happen because nothing is impossible with God. And then her response comes, "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. Let it be unto me according to your word." And the angel leaves, and the story of Jesus's birth goes on. I always think of the Annunciation at this time of year. I suppose I ought to think of it in like March or so, if I were considering a timeline true to the idea of Jesus being born on Christmas. But the beginning of Advent is when I think about Mary and this story that changed the course of her life. It's actually an incredibly complex story, or rather the way it's been used and interpreted and manipulated over time is incredibly complicated. All those images I learned to recognize for art history tests by drawing little sketches in the margins of my course notes, they show a beautiful, demure young woman, often reading, often with lilies near to hand. Gabriel in flowing robes already kneeling before her or floating down ethereally speaks words, sometimes lettered in gold across the space between them. Mary, often with her hand upon her breast, her eyes downcast, is captured in that moment. She declares, "Let it be." In poetry and in music, in the ones we read and sang and heard this morning, Mary is glorified. This perfect specimen of young Jewish womanhood, consenting to God and agreeing to do this thing, in part because who would not be flattered to have found favor with God? Who would not want to be exalted among women, right? And history is written by the victors, by those who dominate and win and then craft the narrative. And so I think a lot about Mary and those moments. For the longest time in Christian, particularly Catholic history, the party line was that Mary is the perfect woman. So perfect, in fact, that whole devotions to her arose. And so too did the need to explain why she was chosen, why she was perfect. And so came about the medieval invention of the Immaculate Conception. That conception being, of course, when Mary was conceived. Medieval theologians determined Mary was born without sin, the one and only human ever to be born this way. Non-biblical Marian devotion and beliefs provided, in some ways, an outlet for female spirituality and female-directed spiritual concern in a way that the traditionally male-identified Godhead did not. And these Marian orientations thrived over centuries. Particularly precious and meaningful to folks were exactly images of Mary as mother, new mother, but also suffering mother after Jesus died. Her favor with God, her courage, and her grief became flashpoints for imagery and prayer and meditation. And in some cultures, she took on importance akin to the Godhead itself. And it all starts with this story. A story that we can easily also read as the non-consensual bearing of a child, a reproductive transgression, a reproductive violence even, on the order of old Greek myths like Leda and the Swan. Yes, Mary says, "Let it be according to your word." But that phrase on its own smacks maybe of resignation, not glad acceptance. From what we are told in the story, too, Mary is being given what will happen, but without full information. God knows, but doesn't have Gabriel share, that this child won't live past 33 and will be killed in a heinous, if common, way. And that Mary will not only have to endure the challenge of telling her fiance and her family that she's pregnant with a God baby, but just over 3 decades later, they are all going to have to mourn him. So she's being told, asked to say yes without complete understanding of what she would be assenting to. And of course, in fairness, Gabriel doesn't ask, he tells. He says, "This is what will happen. This is how it will be." He isn't asking on behalf of God, he's telling. And how do you say no to an angel of the Lord? How do you say no to God? There aren't a lot of versions of the story from Mary's point of view. There are so many beautiful expressions of the traditional view. I love that hymn that Kristen and Morgan sang so beautifully for us. But there are nearly no stories in Mary's voice. Some poems come from Gabriel's point of view, how he felt bad about what he was about to do, or was himself overwhelmed by Mary's beauty and perfection. And honestly, I wrote my colleagues this week asking if anyone knew of a piece that dove into Mary's reaction, that imagined that moment after Gabriel appeared, and whether or not Mary thought to herself, like, what on earth is happening here? Or perhaps something a bit more salty even than that. The lack of imagery and poetry and song doesn't mean that ministers, priests, and pastors haven't wrestled with Mary's place in this story. It's the work of Christian spiritual leaders to make sense of the scriptures, either as truth or as metaphor, depending on your denomination and on your religious leader. Some hold to the old Catholic vision that Mary asking, "How could this be?" shows her autonomy, and her "let it be" shows enthusiastic consent. Others don't even question the notion that she would comply. God asks, she answers, perfect obedience and perfect faith. Still others would say that to insist on consent in our modern understanding of that word is to insist on something that simply didn't exist. Mary would have understood herself as property of her father, of her soon-to-be husband, of her God. Denise Levertoff's poem begins to think through this question. The poem looks at Mary's question of how as grave and courageous, and of her acquiescence as consent. Because Levertov lifts up a moment, one that she writes, no one speaks of, a moment when Levertov says Mary could still refuse, a breath unbreathed, spirit suspended, waiting. Levertov cites Mary's courage, her bravery in saying yes in spite of fear. And Levertov asks us to hear in the story the moment before the one always captured in the images, the moment not of demure acceptance, but of shock and fear and confusion. Levertov very much wants us to read consent here in this story. She insists that Mary had a choice. Devout religious folks who need this story to be true find ways to make it more palatable. And I can hear you out there asking, why on God's green earth is our Unitarian Universalist minister going on and on about Mary and this story? And you're right. I don't believe that Mary was impregnated by the Holy Spirit. I don't believe that Gabriel came down in flowing robes with wings outstretched to deliver a message from God. I don't believe Mary bore God for the salvation of humankind. And the story simultaneously intrigues and horrifies me. It horrifies my modern sensibilities that bristle at the idea of a barely mature girl being told by God she will bear a child and being left by the messenger to figure out what to do next. I don't like the overtones of rape and coercion that I read in the story. Any God of my heart and my belief is not a God that would overturn the life of a child in this way. I absolutely do not believe in the unerring word of Scripture. I cannot abide a theology that insists on misery as the only way to redemption. And I don't even believe that Jesus' birth and death were necessary to redeem humanity, because I don't believe humans are born with inherited sin. I don't need the story of Gabriel announcing impregnation to Mary to be true. So I'm not going on about this morning because I want or need to let God or Gabriel off the hook for this pretty astounding demand they made of a 13-year-old girl. I don't need to let them off the hook or explain a theology based on this moment, because my theology isn't based on this moment or on angels or a God that acts in the world in this way. And I'm certainly not going on about it this morning because I want to turn Mary into a martyr whose life encourages us to martyr ourselves to other people's or to the world's demands. Self-martyring womanhood and obedience are not values I prize. And so, yes, some of you may decide or may have decided long ago that this story and this moment have nothing to teach us, exactly because consent just isn't here, no matter how badly folks want it to be here. It isn't here by any modern standard and understanding of power and coercion. That's okay, of course, if you want to just get rid of this story. The beauty and challenge of a non-dogmatic tradition is that we don't need to save every story. I don't need to create the perfect interpretation for you. We don't need to make things fit, even when humanity has evolved into something better. Our priesthood and prophethood of all believers means you get to read and decide for yourselves and to find the meaning that you need. But I want to ask you to take seriously the idea that in a world that tells stories still and too often from the perspective of the men, the victors, the white folks, this is a tiny moment that offers a glimpse into what a young Middle Eastern Jewish girl went through as a piece of a larger story that has changed the entire course of human history. And as a woman, as a person who made reproductive choices that are outside the typical, as a believer in the power of myth and metaphor, even as I acknowledge that some stories must be excised from the canon because they harm more than they help, as a believer in the value of reinterpretation, I want to find a way to capture what is possible beyond the words in the Gospel of Luke. I want to suggest that perhaps we might keep this story around because it is part of our commonly known mythology, but that we can tell it differently. So we might tell it as a teaching lesson, a negative lesson about how women are sometimes treated as property. We might teach it as a lesson about consent itself, how it wasn't really a choice. We might use it to teach our children about gender roles that were and the possibilities of now. We might use it to question the validity of the whole Christmas story. Maybe this is really all a tale about the ingenuity of a clever young woman who got pregnant out of wedlock and found a way to make her family and community accept that pregnancy. That's my favorite one to think about, to be honest. Mary, maybe along with Joseph, trying to figure out how to get folks on board with her altogether human but too early pregnancy. Maybe we use it as a metaphor to say, however a child is made, the divine is present in each of us. I like that one too. The idea that this story is not about the truth of one particular conception, but the sweeping truth of all human living, that the holy moves in us. Or maybe we can teach it as I sometimes teach covenant. I've told you all before about the midrash that teaches that God shopped the covenant around to other peoples before the Jewish people said yes, that many other groups of people just found the whole deal too onerous until Abraham's people agreed. So maybe Mary wasn't the first one Gabriel visited. Maybe it took a while before they found someone who said yes. Maybe we read, as Levertov and others do, in that moment when Mary says, "How can this be?" Maybe we read there a much longer conversation that Luke didn't feel like recording. Maybe we offer rewrites of the whole thing, as others have. And maybe we let the story be what it is, a complicated and challenging account of an unsought calling. Not a call to martyrdom, as Christian history has made it, but rather an honest recognition that sometimes we just don't get a choice. And that's where I'm landing this year, in this time of a pandemic that none of us chose, with all its attendant grievings and sorrows. Into every single one of our lives, no matter our privilege or lack thereof, moments and challenges arise that we would rather not confront. Some we can reject and walk away from, but the truth is many others we cannot. Things happen to us, and there's nothing we can do about them. And that isn't about exercising our agency. It's about recognizing that humans live interrelated and at the whims of each other and of nature. And sometimes we simply do not have perfect autonomy. Then the story becomes not about glorifying Mary's acceptance, but rather about honoring her attempt to integrate what has happened to her in a way that allows her to live and love and become herself. It isn't about consent. It's about what we do when our ability to consent is denied to us, and we have to face the aftermath of that pain. Maybe then it isn't about that moment of wanting more information and imagining there a possible moment of denial and refusal. Maybe it's more about that moment, which is neither enthusiastic consent nor depressed resignation, when we might imagine Mary saying to herself as much as to Gabriel, "This thing is going to happen. Deep breaths, Mary. Let it be. There'll be a way to live and endure and find joy." I imagine in that "let it be" the beginning of agency after the fact. I imagine a young woman saying, "I have just been handed a pretty crappy job under the guise of being special. I don't have a choice. I don't want this, but I'll be damned if I let it cause me to lose hope." Because while I don't accept a theology of martyrdom, I do accept the truth of human living. And as such, I do need stories about hope in dark times. I do need stories that teach us how to handle sorrow and misery and how to handle the unexpected, unlooked for, and painful experience or calling. The liberation of this story isn't found in Mary's yes, because she never really says yes, courageously or otherwise. The power and liberation of the story is found in Mary's determination, the 9 long months after this moment that lead up to Christmas morning. Mary integrates what she's told, does what is necessary to protect herself given the circumstances she faces, and then she takes on the waiting and the patience that is needed to bring a fetus to infancy, while those around her play their roles too. In a few weeks, we will honor the end of Mary's time of waiting and determination, her 9 months of soul and heart and body and creation work that result in the birth of a prophet who left teachings that could change the world. And if ever there was a year that this story resonates, I think it might be this one. We collectively face a crisis, a trauma, an unexpected calling to protect each other in the face of a virus that has no care for human need or human life. We could rail against it, refuse to wear masks, refuse to accept the truth of it all, but we know what happens then. More death, more strife, more misery. Or instead, we can choose to accept that this thing has happened to us. For 9 months now, we have faced the pandemic here in this country. 9 months of trying to accept and integrate the reality of facing the consequences when we don't, and of waiting with hope for a vaccine to be created that might change the world. Still, we wait, not knowing exactly what the future will hold, not knowing when things might shift, when we might be able to return to each other. But still, we are determined to take action however we can to create safety and to care for each other. Still, we are determined to find joy, together online, in our homes, with our pets, with television, art, and books, and walks in the cold winter air. Beauty can still be found in the midst of pain and what feels like interminable waiting. There are truths in the lessons of Advent, no matter the factuality of the stories. Truths about the liberation of acceptance when we cannot change reality, about the necessity of patience, which teaches us to embrace what is, and about the power of determination to do what we need to create a better world. We don't need to set aside our values to read these truths and these stories, because we can reread, reinterpret, use our imaginations and our empathy to find these deep truths. And then, when guided by our values that ask us to seek wholeness and love, we find affirmation that even in hard times, human ingenuity, human kindness, and human living will create hope. May hope abound this season as we reread and retell our stories, as we wait and we watch and we work for a better world. So may it be.